Why are we called communist? Many of the time we are called communist. We are a Christian organization, and we have not, many of us have not interacted with much of the communist literature. We are serving Christ and pushing for social justice. We are anti-racist, anti-imperialism, anti-white supremacy, and we have been redeemed by the blood of Jesus Christ. But you still have people who want to brand us as non-Christian and communist because of that type of thinking and that type of social activism. This is not something that is uniquely, happening to us in South Africa. Even when one goes to America, you do get the same. Among black Christians, you do have, the black conservatives who side with the white conservative, calling black Christians and white Christians who are fighting racism and all these types of social ill, and then they will brand them as communist, Marxist, cultural Marxist, critical race theorist, wokeist. It's the same even here in South Africa. We do have a video where we talk about the differences between conservative beliefs in America and in South Africa. So even here in South Africa, within the white conservative circles and the blacks who are around those circles, they tend to brand all those who stand against white supremacy, racism, promoting social justice in the society, engaging in that type of social activism. They don't care if you're a Christian or what, they will just brand you as a communist, as a Marxist, as a wokeist, critical race theorist. And this is currently growing, it's becoming big, especially in America, and they are trying to sort of reintroduce. I'll explain why I say reintroduce as the video goes. They are trying to reintroduce, that type of thing where you brand people as communist and then you start a war with them. So just also to give a brief history before I answer the question why we are called communist. With communism, many people like to talk about, communism and brand people as communism, but they do not, even have the slightest clue what communism was all about, or who founded it, or, the history of it. I'm just going to give a brief overview of that. Communism, pioneered by Karl Marx. Karl Marx was a German Jew in Europe. He was born, he was raised within a context of, a Christian family. I think the mother and father were Lutherans. They also converted to Christianity because of the persecution that Jews were experiencing at that time. So Karl Marx grew up in that Christian context. When he was 18, he went to university. He rejected Christianity and embraced atheism and some of the radical ideas that he found in the universities. And he later on met a friend by Friedrich Engels, whom shared the same views with Karl Marx, and they began to push these communist ideas. And then in 1848, through a draft given to him by Friedrich Engels, Karl Marx, wrote the Communist Manifesto, with the help of Friedrich Engels. And this small booklet became so powerful. Its impact is still felt even today. The Communist Manifesto, the socialist communist and other types, anarchist and other types of movements that are trying to fight what they perceived as capitalist exploitation in the world, are deeply influenced by this Communist Manifesto written by Karl Marx. So in this Communist Manifesto, remember that with Karl Marx, in the 1848, his writing of the Communist Manifesto, so that gave him a position as one of the early pioneers of what we now call, sociological studies, with people such as your Du Bois and your was Max Weber. Those were the early pioneers of, we can say, white sociologists for Karl Marx and Max Weber, and black sociologists when it comes to Du Bois. And so with Karl Marx and his Communist Manifesto and what he stood for and his views, he viewed history as a battle between two groups, rich, poor, lords, serf, bourgeoisie, proletariat, propertied, those who are not propertied. And therefore these two have been involved in a struggle, where at some point, one became overpowered the other group, and sometimes, the powerful group continued maintaining their power, or sometimes those who were not propertied became victorious and they overpowered the previous powerful group, and then they took over and established a new hegemony, creating other material conditions which caused, the dominant group, to be overthrown or sometimes to subdue the less dominant in the society. So history, he views history in that perspective. And he contributed a lot in terms of that, because when you do look at Europe, you do find that his argument is very persuasive. And he also he was deeply anti-capitalistic. He hated capitalism, he hated the free market, he hated, the ownership of property by individuals. And so he sought the destruction of classes within the society, because with the existence of classes means that the existence of exploitation, the existence of capitalism. So he sought to see a classless society under, communist utopia. He sought the abolition of the traditional family because he saw it as being used to maintain capitalist ends. And if you do look, to some extent, that was true, but just because something is true in Europe doesn't mean that it is now true everywhere else. Communism in that sense does have some, white superiority within it. He also was anti-religion, religion being the opium, of the press, the drug, that dull, the oppressed into accepting their own oppression. And so he hated religion. And remember, this guy was an atheist. And then, as after the publishing of his Communist Manifesto, there were certain people who began to adopt his views, and there were certain groups who came into existence as a result of the acceptance of those views. And one of them who became so very influential was, who's this guy? Vladimir Lenin. Very, very powerful Russian, who is also of Jewish stock, I think from his maternal side, if I'm just like Karl Marx. Vladimir Lenin was in Russia, and in Russia at that time it was ruled by a very powerful family, the Tsars. It was a Tsarist regime, with the Tsar being, the dominant family, noble birth, ruling Russia. And the brother of Vladimir Lenin was killed by, the Tsarist regime, and that angered Lenin. And then he dedicated his life to the overthrow of the Tsarist regime. He then worked, manipulated, and did all this type of things, and he was deeply influenced by Karl Marx. And then something happened in 1917 in what is called the October Revolution of 1917. He became successful. They overthrew the Russian Tsarist dynasty and put an end to it. And something that happened is that their doing of that, they were deeply funded by the capitalist West. That's the iron of this whole thing. With Lenin, when he was in exile, coming back to Russia before the 1917 October Revolution, what happened is that he came via Germany, and the Germans, who hated Russia, gave him a lot of money, and then made sure that he makes his way to Russia and to lead the so-called revolution there. And his friend, who was a very close friend of his, Leon Trotsky, was also at some point exiled in style, I think in America and in other parts of Europe, where he was well funded by the capitalists of that time. Thus has been exposed. It's not a conspiracy or what, it's a fact. Those guys were funded by the capitalist, and even with Karl Marx, he was also funded by the capitalist. He lived his life funded by the capitalist. And so in 1917, these guys took over. They overthrew the Tsarist regime, killed that family, and they began to take over Russia. And Russia, the Soviet Union at that time, as it was called, became the first communist state in the world. It became via the influence of Karl Marx. And so something that happened is that with Lenin, he was different from the other communists. So the other communists did not quite like violence per se. With Lenin, he was for violence. He believed that for a communist utopia to be established, that has to be done through violence. So he was a person who was for violence, and he had a man whom was into that, Joseph Stalin, who also later on ruled Russia. So in 1917, October Revolution, when they took power, this sent fear across Europe. That's where then you have this fear of communism, especially within capitalist societies in Europe. That's communist takeover, communist revolutionaries. And their fears were genuine, because you began to have this movement advocating for revolutions across Europe, and they were supported by the first communist state, Russia, even China, under Mao Zedong, via communism took over, power, and other, places across the world. Even Hitler was fearful of communism. In Italy, they were fearful, especially the Catholic Church, fearful of communism, and to the extent that even Mussolini, who was raised within sort of socialist communist family, because of looking at what was currently happening, rejected communism and started to embrace fascism, allied with Nazism, and they were all opposed to communism. So, but now Europe, in the 1900s was gripped in fear, of this communist, takeover. Then came the World Wars. World War One. Now, in 1917, when the revolution took place, that was before the end of World War One. So World War One started in 1914 and ended in 1918. So 1914 to 1918. So when those guys in 1917 took power, it was before the end of World War One. So they utilized, what the chaos that was happening there to then take power. And then World War II, came into being 1939 to 1945. So what happened during World War II is that, now since people fearing communism, and then, where you then have the birth of Nazism, fascism, capitalism become also powerful, and then you have communism. These major ideologies and other smaller ideologies that also existed across the world fighting for world dominance. You then had during World War II, capitalism joining with communism to fight fascism and Nazism, and then capitalism and communism became successful. And then when World War II ended, capitalism and communism, the capitalist state deeply represented by Britain and America, largely America, and then you had the communist states represented by the Soviet Union. They became powerful when World War II ended in 1945. They became very victorious, and they became the two hegemonic powers in the world. And then they were then also engaged in a new struggle of world dominance, and that's where we have the Cold War, which started after World War II to 1989 with the fall of the Berlin Wall. So the apartheid government in South Africa, just after the end of World War II, the Afrikaners in South Africa, World War II ended in 1945, and then in 1948 the Afrikaners in South Africa took power. Remember the Nationalist Party. We've made a video on that, talking about the Christian Secret Society, the Broederbond. If you can go and check, we did a video on that, how they took power. So in 1948 they took power, these guys. And then in their taking of power, remember, Afrikaners, you had the British first, who were the dominant, group. And then in their seeking of exploiting South Africa and the natives, they brought in the Boers. They hated the Boers. They even put them in concentration camp. But now, because they wanted allies in their exploitation of the land and the native, so they picked those who are closer to them, white, and that was what the Boers. They chose the Boers, the Afrikaners, and then formed the Union in 1910, and they began to rule South Africa, exploiting the resources and the natives. And then in 1948 the Boers became the dominant political group, you see. And then when they took power, when the Boers took power, they understood that they are the same as the Europeans. These Europeans were their brothers, especially the West. So now they are taking power, and now globally there's this Cold War that is currently happening between the United States and Russia. And they were deeply on the side of the West. Even in World War One, you had many of the guys going to fight on behalf of Western powers. So now they are European. They are sharing a lot with Britain, the Western countries, including America. And then there's this Cold War. They are these capitalists, and then there are these communists. These communists hate capitalists. They are anti-imperialist, anti-colonialism. They are pushing for revolutions, change in society. The communists on this side, and then the capitalists on the side are more like conservative. They want to keep the existing institutions and values and all of that. So the Boers, the Afrikaners, allied themselves with the Western nation. So they became one with the Western nation. And so just after taking power in 1948, in 1950, there was an act which they passed, which is the Suppression of Communism Act of 1950. Power 48, and all of a sudden they are already beginning to pass these acts to suppress communism. And it was because of communists at that time had already been in South Africa, and they were working with the native South Africans who were fighting against white supremacy, were fighting against racism, exploitation, colonization, all this evil which was imposed on this land by Europeans, by white people. They were fighting against it. And the communists in South Africa, who later became the South African Communist Party as we know it today, which is an ally of the ANC, they were already in South Africa working with the ANC. And as they were working with the ANC, our native ancestors in South Africa, were getting, all types of literatures across the world, reading, in order to understand what was happening globally, to be able to articulate their views so that they can be heard by modern ears, and thus, get support to achieve their own liberation in their own land. And so they were reading, and that scared the racist white regime, and therefore they quickly moved and passed this act of 1950, and it's called the Suppression of Communist Act of 1950. But something that happened with this act is that not only did they suppress, so-called communist parties, but any party that stood against them was then branded as communist. And then if it was then branded as communist, therefore it was illegal. People were detained without trial, some killed, destroyed, all those type of things happened to them. And then because the government at that time, that was the current status quo, that existed. Many of these white churches, white conservative churches, especially the Reformed churches, the so-called Reformed churches that like to boast about sound doctrines and all of that, took that position of the government and also began, to talk about the communist threat in South Africa. So the communist threat and the takeover of blacks, began, assimilated, integrated, in this fear of, creating this anxiety and fear among people. And so even preachers, the pulpits were talking about communists. So everyone who was just against, the apartheid government was then branded as a communist. For example, the ANC, not everyone within the ANC was, a communist. There were communists in the ANC, there were capitalists in the ANC, there were socialists in the ANC, there were traditionalists in the ANC, there were communalists in the ANC. Not everyone was a communist in the ANC, but also it was suppressed because of that. And even today, you still find white conservative racist white conservatives still branding the ANC as a communist party. The PAC, which rejected communism, was still branded as a communist party. The Black consciousness movement, led by people such as your Bantu Biko, bear in mind, these were Christian men, but also they were branded, and suppressed under the Suppression of the Communist Act of 1950 and other, laws, which these criminals, came up with. So, and from that, you then begin to have this culture, of branding everything that is against those racist, white, Christian, conservative circles. Anything that is against that is then branded as a communist. So today, that is currently how that came into being. So when those people are calling us communist, they are operating from that history. They are a continuation of that oppressive history. They are picking from that oppressive history even to our modern context. You even had books by people such as your Vudi Boham, who is a well-respected black conservative from the United States, wrote a book, Fourth Line, in which he plagiarized, he misquoted people, he did all of sorts of stuff. But the book is one of, the best sellers there. Why? Because it is, repeating there's fears, these lies of there being, groups who are communist, cultural Marxists, trying to destroy the so-called Christian civilization, trying to destroy Christendom. And you had people who knew nothing about communism or Marxism being branded as, communist Marxist. And some of us, like all the things that we can do, all the things that we do when it comes to racism, anti-colonialism and what can be traced from the works that were done by our ancestors from the 1700s. When Marx was not even born. But you'll still have people calling us communist, as if, we just knew about these things, from Karl Marx. So you have all those type of people. So in the apartheid time, a person will be branded, dehumanized and destroyed. The border wars that were fought along, those lines. Our ancestors were branded because they were fighting against white supremacy, and the white supremacists wanted to keep what they had, and therefore they needed to find ways to which they can destroy the one who is fighting against them, and then justify that as being, in the plan of God. So they will do what? They will brand a person to be a communist. After branding a person to be a communist, they will demonize that person, and then everyone will be like, yeah, he's a communist, he's dirty, he's a monster, he's filthy. And then from there, they will destroy the person. Once they destroy you, they were killing our ancestors and whatnot. So people just didn't care. The white conservative reform racist cycles just didn't care. In fact, they supported their government for doing that because, hey, these communists are monsters. But now these guys, they can't do the destroying part. So now they are doing what? The branding and the dehumanizing part. So they are calling us that so that they can dehumanize us and sort of like create this fear so that people can run away from us because, hey, there's a communist, there's a radical, there's a Marxist, cultural Marxist. They are trying to destroy Christianity. They are bringing evil doctrines within Christianity. They are doing all sorts of stuff. So that's what is currently happening, and this is why we are being called communist, even though we do not have anything to do with communism. I hope you enjoyed that video. Don't forget to subscribe, like, comment, critique, and we will respond to you. Thank you very much.